So thank you everybody for joining us today. For those of you that haven't watched one of these before, my name is Josh. I'm the managing director and co-founder at JB Andrews. Now we and I recruit everywhere from San Diego on the west coast of the US to Shanghai in China in the diagnostics market. I'm here with Varun. Varun and I are going to talk about all things epigenetics, and instead of me doing him a disservice, I will allow him to introduce himself. So Varun, over to you. Let us know, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Josh. First of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity and speaking platform. It's not every day you get to talk about a little bit about yourself, but also the work that you're passionate about. So this is awesome. My name is Varun Dwarka. I am currently residing in Lexington, Kentucky, in the United States. But I'm essentially a scientist. I am a bioinformatician. I use a lot of data analytics on biological data sets. And some of the questions that I try to address are associated with aging. How do we calculate age? How do we look at biological age? But then more importantly, how much information can we gather from these different biomarkers called DNA methylation? I always wasn't in this realm. It's not that this ever kind of this wasn't a product of a plan, if you will.
Yeah.
Which it never is. I think right before this we were talking a little bit about that. I'm actually a native of San Francisco, California. I grew up there in Silicon Valley. I think that had a little bit to do with my upbringing. And I was a musician in my past life. That was actually how, that's kind of was my first love and passion, with a close second being science and technology. But anyway, I went through my years of college, my uni days, as you'll say. During my uni days, I did my undergrad at University of California, Santa Cruz, and started to realize this beautiful nexus between biology and data science, really called bioinformatics. And for those that don't know, Santa Cruz was actually one of the locations where they assembled the first human genome. And I think that working in that environment, again, everything is environmental. And why I'm really stressing that is going to lead into my research. It led me to kind of do stints at Stanford, UC San Francisco, and then ultimately a PhD at University of Kentucky, which is why I'm located in the state of Kentucky. Studied salamanders for a while, but really honed in on understanding how genomes and how these salamanders are able to regenerate their tissues, because for those of you that don't know, salamanders are able to regenerate all sorts of their appendages, from entire limbs to half their brain to spinal cord. And the way that we were tackling that was using this concept of bioinformatics, looking at gene regulation and this concept of DNA methylation. After I finished my grad school, right down the street, fortuitously, was this company called Diagnostic, which is where I serve as the director of bioinformatics now. They were looking at using DNA methylation as a way to estimate your biological age. And so in almost like a random chance that seemed very calculated, that's how I ended up at Diagnostic. And I've spent the last 3.5 years kind of building the entire bioinformatics team, hiring amazing researchers, and kind of looking into, how do we take more from the human blood and actually look at aspects of their aging biology, A, and then B, can we actually use DNA methylation as almost a replacement to all of your standard biological age measurements and your health metrics, like your HbA1c, CRP, and such. And we use a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. And there probably are a couple of people watching this wondering, where do I recognize that face from? And one of the great stories that I learned about you very early on in our discussions, because I had that same question, was, where is Varun's face from? So why don't you tell us, if anybody's sort of got a bit of a burning desire to learn why they think this guy might be famous, why don't you answer them?
I will say, so I don't know if I'm famous, but I think people, if they do recognize me, may recognize me from the Netflix documentary called "You Are What You Eat." Um, One of the things that was part of that documentary, which if you haven't seen the documentary, it was on Netflix, looking at a set of twins that where one set of twins was going through a vegan diet or consuming a vegan diet, and then the other set of twins was consuming an omnivorous diet. And the whole concept of that was whether which of these diets actually had more beneficial health measurements at the end of the 8-week trial. And this was actually interesting because that's kind of where we applied a lot of these predictors.
Yeah.
Building a predictor is, you can build a predictor. You can use different types of modeling techniques and all of that. The proof of concept, though, is how do you use it and what kind of information do you get? And this was the perfect platform, which ended up on Netflix, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome. And so just to take things back a step, and we'll talk in varying levels of sort of science for this discussion. Some people watching will be PhDs like yourself. Other people will be lay persons that perhaps have just watched a Netflix documentary. Other people are somewhere in between, like myself, right? And so we'll keep some of this basic. We'll go into a little bit of detail in some other areas. Let's start at the sort of highest level, keep things really broad. But why do you think epigenetic testing is important?
Absolutely. I think the concept of epigenetic testing may be foreign to a lot of people, but genetic testing, on the other hand, may be a little bit more approachable. And so when you're thinking of genetic testing, you're trying to understand how your DNA is essentially associating with, potential diseases that you might get later on in life. And so when you do a genetic test, you're looking at mutations that are in your DNA, essentially your genome, and how those mutations are going to link to potential causes of diseases. What people may not fully understand now is that that's not the only regulation of how your genome is being interpreted. There's an entire layer called epigenetics, where multiple different biomarkers of sorts are able to regulate if that mutation even gets expressed or even gets manifested to that disease.
Yeah.
And what's controlling that, especially in the context of this particular epigenetic mark called DNA methylation, is that it's influenced by your environment. So really understand that your environment is causing whether those DNA methylation changes are changing, either it's unmethylated or methylated at a specific DNA site. And so what this allows is a little bit more of how your environment is able to affect your risk of disease. And one of the things that we've been able to see is that things like smoking can change your DNA methylation and actually open up the expression or the manifestation of specific diseases. So essentially, your DNA may not be changing, but the change of your epigenetics is then causing or is then allowing for this entire, let's say, disease association to increase or decrease that way. And so from that regard, I think it's much more of an actionable test versus something like a genetic test where you really take it once, but your genome doesn't really change, or nor should it change at the rate that your epigenetics will.
And so is this simplifying it too far? Could you say that your genetic makeup is there and certain environmental factors will either just turn that on or not? Is that too simple a way of looking at it?
No, I think that's a fair way of looking at it, because essentially your epigenetics, your body has figured out that you don't have to change the hardware. You can just alter the software that really interprets the hardware, which the hardware is your DNA, and then the software are those epigenetic marks.
Awesome. And so one test that is fairly famous because it's a legacy test in this area, I won't say this specific field, but in this area, is the 23andMe test, right? Now, what would you say that the difference between that sort of test is and something that like True Diagnostic produce? And I believe that's the True Check, right? I think that's your most recent test.
We started with the True Age test, and actually we're having a new test that was recently just announced called the True Health test, which I can also explain as well. But something like so 23andMe, you know, I'm actually I'll just say it. I'm a fan. I think it started this
Yeah.
with the entire area, which, you know, I'm proud to be a part of. But the thing with 23andMe is that it is a great test to understand what are your underlying predispositions to disease.
Yeah.
Again, it's looking at those genetic marks, which is very important to understand as a baseline. But you're not going to be taking a 23andMe test, you know, once a year or once every 6 months. No, I mean, you can, but you won't expect much of a change, again, because your
Yeah.
genome isn't readily changing. Your DNA isn't readily changing. This is where, especially when the company was founded, when we founded the company, um, the idea was, okay, well, if you can create a business on a single test across everyone, why not create a
Mm.
business on a biomarker that we know scientifically that it is changing based on the environmental exposures? And we saw a niche for that area, and we kind of took it. And so again, it was, you know, we have a great group. I have to give a shout out to Ryan Smith, Hannah Wendt,
Yeah.
Jeremy Delk. So there's a whole bunch of people that were there from day one, and Tavis Mendez, another one to include. But what we started to see was that was the niche market that really needed to be addressed, and also a market that provided actionable insight, because
Yeah.
your biological age measure will change based on the exposures to your environment, how much you drink, how much you smoke, what kind of nutrients that you eat, whether you're on a vegan diet or an omnivore diet. It
Yeah.
changes based
Yeah.
off of that.
Yeah. And um, then if we bring it into, I guess I'm going to call it the area of sort of longevity and
Mhm.
biological age testing and treatment as well, because there's both sides of this. What makes the true diagnostics testing different to some of the sort of more generic clocks that you might get out there that
Yeah.
you can test?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess to define a generic clock, if you will, one way that we've been looking at it are generations. So you have your first
Yeah.
generation of clocks where they were actually trained on chronological age. So if you're able to bear with me, I'm going to go a little bit into the rabbit
Yeah.
hole.
Yeah.
A
Go.
little bit, yeah. So the idea here is that you're picking which of these biomarkers using machine learning are highly predictive of the output. And you can
Mm.
change that output. So those first generations, what they started to see, and my hats off to Steve Horvath, who really founded this field or really pushed for this field. They started to identify that chronological age, so the age based on your date of birth, if you identified which of these biomarkers are able to predict that, there was always a deviation between
Yeah.
the chronological age and what that output was. That difference was actually that biological age acceleration. So if your value was higher than your chronological age, that was accelerated. Vice versa, decelerated. And it's that difference that people picked up on. But if you can kind of think about it, if you're looking for biological age, why are you training this to chronological age? Because in the
Mm.
past, we already have great, you know, phenotypic scores. Like if you go to a doctor, there's literally a score called the Charleston Comorbidity Index, which will tell you in 10 years what is the probability that you will pass away or die from, you know, complications or whatnot. So then as time went on, the field itself started to train off of that score. And what they started
Yeah.
to see is that if you train and pick those biomarkers based off of that score, it improves your association to disease. So what makes us different is that we care not about the age score itself or the age value.
Yeah.
It's the relation of that score to your risk of disease. And so we've developed our clock really under that guise. So
Mm.
essentially, with Harvard, we've actually created our own epigenetic age test where we've
Yeah.
incorporated not only epigenetics, but proteomics. So looking at your protein values, your metabolomics, your metabolite values, all layers of molecular biology synthesized into one essentially score. And what we
Mm.
hope at the time when we were building it is that it would capture more of that disease risk. And actually, that's what we saw in a preprint that we published about a year ago. Currently, it's being reviewed in a very high impact peer reviewed journal.
Mm.
But that's what we saw, that the combination of all of those metrics, which is different than most other companies,
Yeah.
actually allowed us to have a signal that was much more related to disease risk.
And then I haven't, forgive me, I haven't looked into the details of True Diagnostics portfolio, but do you then offer advice on what people can do to reduce the risk? What's the solution? It's great knowing that you might be likely to have something or not likely. There's got to be some sort of action.
Yeah, and that's actually, so once we built the clock, another arm of our entire research and development team, which I've been I've been leading with Ryan Smith, is that we've been also testing these clocks in interventions, which is why that whole Netflix documentary came out. So let's say you take metformin. How does that clock change? Does it go decrease or increase? And then based off of those interventional trials and the scientific validation, that's how, like, a lot of our clinical geneticists, or epigeneticists, if you will, we actually have a team of those individuals where they will give insight based on either the scientific research, but because this is such a nascent field, I would like to say, I'm proud to say that we're one of the few early ones, if not the early contender in this area. We've been noticing within even our physician and patient market certain associations, and so we can then give you some insight based on what we've seen with other patients. And so absolutely, the number itself is important, the association to disease is important, but what's even more important is, what do I do? Answering that question. And that's something that we've been tackling, especially in the last year or so.
Awesome. Now, one thing that you what you did very well at the top of the call is you introduced yourself in a very humble way. Now, for those watching, what I should say is that you're quite a unique individual, and that your background really is as a biologist, right? And then you've taken an interest in computer science after that. So you have this sort of unique experience where you understand, excuse me, the human biology, but also then how to collect data, interpret data, and then create action from there. Now, for me, I think you're a really good person to ask this next question, which is, where do you think the science is trending? And kind of like a follow-up question. In the research that I've done, I can see there's lots of different organizations trying to create therapeutics to delay aging, maybe even reverse aging. Like, where do you think the science is going to go?
I think ultimately what we want to be able to do is track health span. I think that's one aspect in the diagnostic market or the biomarker market. And so the thing that we are acknowledging is that, right now we are perfect for this time. And I actually, even the word perfect gives me the creeps. Like, it's like, I don't feel like there's always improvement, right? The question then becomes, where do we improve, or how do we improve? And so, for example, the methodologies that we're using now may be antiquated in the future. And so that's what a lot of our machine learning and AI team is doing, is like, okay, this is how we did the first one. Okay, like, let's say this multi-omic clock or this epigenetic clock. What can we do? Let's go back into the engine. Let's try to dismantle and see, okay, where can we improve upon this? Can we apply another type of modeling technique? Then we have to validate that modeling technique. Just to say that, okay, is that output actually associating better with the disease risk and all of that? What other actionable insight can you gather from that value? Because even though it's a number, people are making life decisions, their health decisions based on their number. So that's one area of the field that I think that, we're trying to figure out different ways of feature selection. How do we know that these biomarkers are biologically accurate? Because one of the things with AI, especially, when you talk about LLMs and transformer methods or variable autoencoders, no one knows how that black box works. And the computer science area, I think one area of research on that side is, how do you interpret, or how do you actually figure out the black box? And so for a biologist, I care about what's driving that black box, because if you understand that, then you can describe that to the person at the end, which is the patient. So I think that there's a lot of work being done there. And then from the other side is more interventions. Let's keep testing that, which kind of leads to here. You create a new clock. Cool, that's great. Let's test it. Is it actually working the way that it is? And most of the time, what we've been seeing is that every single clock is trained a different way, and therefore it exists in a different manner. So Certain clocks are great in a certain use case. Other clocks are great in another use case. And so then it becomes us being we have the responsibility to explain, use this in this method because we've shown it in this, paper. And so we have to be able to communicate that. So there's that sector. And then I think the sector that's really sexy and the one that everyone really thinks about is, how do you then reverse age? I want to say that you cannot reverse age. What you can do is slow down the aging process. It is a feed-forward loop. So I guess the better thing is, how do we slow down age, or how do we maximize the health span? And that's where a lot of the work, I have to give a shout out to RetroBio and Altos Labs. That's kind of where, they're using all of the tools that are built here. Some of them are actually from our own company, to really test that measure, because again, if you don't know if you're slowing down aging if you don't have a measure to actually use it. And so I think in that realm, those are the three facets. And I think that each facet, like especially in this realm of, rejuvenation, there's a lot of work being done. And I think that that's actually an area that I've been kind of like, also setting my eye on, of just like, how do we improve this side to help these guys?
Yeah. Do you think rejuvenation could be somewhat of a misleading term for the way that they describe these sorts of things? Because like you've just said, you're not reversing anything. But then I guess I might answer my own question here and say that rejuvenating doesn't necessarily mean it's reversing it. It's maybe perhaps returning it to where it should be. I don't know. What would be really helpful actually for the audience here that hasn't seen one of my previous videos is for you to very quickly define what we mean by health span, because improving health span rather than reversing aging is definitely what the common thread is that we're seeing in people like yourself that are key opinion leaders in this field are saying. But define for the layman on the street what that actually means.
Yeah, so kind of like lifespan, which is essentially the length at which you're existing on this world. Health span is how much of that length is actually in good health, or how much of it is in a healthy state that is optimal for the time that you are. And so what we've been noticing is that you can live until 120, which expands the lifespan. But then if you are starting to feel sick by 80, and then the last 40 years are bedridden, that health span is pretty terrible, if you ask me. But then compare that to an individual who lived, like, for example, my granddad. He passed away at the age, I think, about 87 or 88. But literally until the last day, he was mobile. He was going to the farmers markets in India and all that. Literally one day, he just felt kind of weird, went to the hospital, and passed away in his sleep. Personally, for me, the silver lining is that is a great health span, because essentially until the time that he passed away, he was living life to presumably his optimal length, or his optimal health span, if you will. And so that's kind of the idea. And so when it comes to reversing aging, if you are at an elevated, let's say, biological age, sure, you can reverse it to where you should be, but you can't expect yourself to be back to 12 years old.
3 years old.
But there are people like Brian Johnson, who I think I actually see in high regard, who maybe that's, again, based on the science that we see, but maybe that might not be the case. Maybe we can actually take it all the way back. And so I think that, from my own personal opinion, I think that the rejuvenation is there, because rejuvenation can also be cellular. You can revert you can reverse the aging effects to a standard that is consistent with your age. But we might have some experiences of other individuals where they are able to reverse it even lower, to maybe what is similar to a 20-year-old, which it seems like Brian Johnson is doing.
And it'd be very interesting if it does go that way. Now, circling back to what you just said about the where the science is trending, I can imagine then the therapeutics businesses and the companies like yourself that are at the cutting edge of the diagnostics will start to work quite closely together, right? Because you'll be developing companion diagnostics to test whether or not these therapies are actually rejuvenating in the way that you're hoping.
Yes. Yeah, and actually that's a huge part of our business is actually from a research perspective is, hey, you have a supplement, let's test it out. We
Yeah.
also acknowledge that these are certain biomarkers, right? Like again, you can create a biomarker based on any kind of physiological or molecular output. But the one that really makes us exciting of why epigenetics is a great biomarker is because it's capturing that risk of disease at a
Mm.
higher predictiveness than a lot of things like HbA1c or your CRP levels, or let's say even your hip weight ratios. That was something that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
done before. And so based on that facet, we've worked with the likes of Estee Lauder, Olaplex, SRW Labs in New Zealand. doTERRA is another one, and then we've had interest from L'Oreal, where or even I guess the Purina dog food, where
Mm.
essentially they want to understand if their products are actually doing what they say they're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where we've been able to test and give scientific advice of like, hey, these values are changing. This makes sense in the context of what you're trying to do. So yeah, that is a part of our research business that we tackle.
Interesting. And then as we asked the previous guest that we had on talking about this topic to ask you a question. I told him you were coming on, and he was
Oh,
very
really?
interested to
Is it
learn.
Tony? Was it Tony?
Yeah, it was Tony. So for those that
Yeah.
haven't seen the video, Tony Pemberton is the CEO of Epigenetics. Now he was curious for you to answer this question. I think I sent this to you before. I hope I did. If I didn't, we're going to get your honest, immediate
Let's
answer.
go.
But he wants to know whether you think lifestyle questionnaires specifically will become a focus point in compiling big data when conducting epigenetic tests.
Yeah, 100%. We actually do that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the experience for the customer is that, you take the test, but then we also have a intake survey, where we actually ask a little bit about, not only your risk of disease, but what are you doing with your, with your life? Like, what is your drinking habits? How often do you work out? Even things like how often do you have sex? Because all of these things have contributed to increased and decreased epigenetic ages based on their chronological age. I think that for a company, and that's where, I will say, knock on wood, we found success is because it's not just the development of these tools. It's also the accumulation of the data that has matched
Yeah.
metadata. Because
Yeah.
and one of the things I do want to say is most of the time we don't actually develop a whole lot of tools on our data set. And that's one thing that people are using our data set to create like IP. It's like that is the goal, but what we've noticed is that our data set is a great testing data set because they're usually the people that are taking our test are the cream of the crop. And so we
Yeah.
need metadata to actually understand what are those associations. So to Tony, yes, absolutely. And if a company isn't doing that, then maybe what are you guys doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, like the sort of cynic in me then thinks, well, how honest are people going to answer those questions if they know that their environmental behaviors are going to be the ones? Because most people are rational enough to be able to say, well, I'm not exercising loads, I'm smoking loads, I'm drinking loads.
Yeah.
Perhaps they're going to put me in this bucket that I don't want to be in.
Yeah. And so
what do you think about the human element in this, like the human error of the questionnaire or the human element?
Yeah, so there is a disconnect because we have both the healthcare practitioners and then the direct to consumers. I will say a large portion of the people that take our tests go through a doctor, a healthcare practitioner, and the doctor actually serves as like a filtering of, let's say, BS. Obviously, with the DTC market, we have to take the word of the consumer, but this is actually one of the from a bioinformatics and data analysis portion, the least sexy job that we have and the most important job that we have is data curation and data filtering.
Yeah.
So our entire team, and I have to give a shout out to Natalia Carreras and Laura Balaguer, who are on our team. They're just like a lot of their time is spent on making sure that the data that we have is curated properly. And because that is the data that gets sent out to, not only to our modeling team, as well as, just other teams within our organization that are helping with, assessment, like let's say general population statistics. We want to be able to compare your scores versus everyone else. So yeah, that is something that we think of, but that is a responsibility that we take seriously because it also affects how we interpret these predictors.
Awesome. One final question that I definitely didn't send to you because I've just thought of it now, but you are clearly very passionate about what you do. And actually, I don't think I've ever had somebody give so many shout outs to their colleagues on one of these videos. So you're clearly very passionate about the team that you work with as well, which actually is really inspiring. What was one of the first things that you did when you started to see the validity of this test? What are one of the first things that you did in terms of action, if any, to sort of adjust your lifestyle to mitigate any sort of disease risks? Was there anything that you were like 6 months into the job with True where you were like, well, actually, I can't be taking this test or developing this test and not by living by some of the things that we're advising other people? Because Tony, to talk about Tony again, he's in the top 40 of the Rejuvenation Olympics. Like he absolutely lives and breathes everything to do with what he talks about. So going back to the question, what if anything did you do when you first started seeing the power of these tests?
If you don't mind me, I will be maybe brutally honest. And so the reason why I give shout outs is because I realize that coming into this position, especially going through grad school and all that, you are very cynical and you think of the negatives in life.
Yeah.
One of the things that is really powerful about this test, which wasn't something that if you look through the scientific literature, you'll see the association of mental health to epigenetic output, especially with Deneen pace. So I think one of the things that I started to do was, so I think the biggest thing was, trying to figure out what contributes to a better mental health state. Yeah. So some of the easiest things was cutting alcohol. That was one of the biggest things that was maybe this is too honest, but yeah, that was a thing that was affecting my life at that time. Cutting that out to an extent where it was like 90 to 95% gone. Exercise was a huge thing. Diet was actually something that, I've been raised vegetarian, so it wasn't too much of a change, but also understanding nutrient supplementation. But then more importantly is just stress management, because I think the early days, like when I first started, the bioinformatics team wasn't built. It was just me for about a year and a half until we had all these amazing people join. And so there were a lot of times that, and I think even the founders will attest to this, because even before that, like I can't imagine what they were going through. It's like trying to figure out like what allows you to be in that better mental state. And I've seen that even though I'm not the best ager, I will say I'm probably at the bottom 40. I've seen improvements just based on trying to figure out that, that mind body connection. And it's made me a believer that the mind body connection is absolutely there. So, and it's just weird that like those values actually make you believe a little bit. So I think that was like the biggest thing. Those were like the few things I've already changed, and just trying to be positive even when shit hits the fan. I apologize for swearing.
That's fine. It's good to be honest, and I was very honest to Tony when he sort of talked me through his story, in that as somebody that runs a business, he's obviously a business owner as well. You are somebody that's on an accelerated, career trajectory at the moment. I would imagine between the three of us, we work quite hard. And so for me, the question for him was like, how do you manage that and manage the stress? Because I think the stress side of things, as I mentioned at the top of the call, I'm running a recruitment business here. It's an international company, so working hours can be pretty extensive. How do you manage all of that? Like, what would be if you were going to give one tip to somebody that's saying stress is probably the thing that's aging me the most? And he sent me some great pictures of World War II or World War One's guys who went at 18 and they came back 4 years later and they looked like they were 45.
Yeah.
Very clear demonstration that stress does age.
Yeah.
Do you have any top tips for anybody that would be struggling with that sort of thing?
Yeah. Just recognize it's a rat race, and as bleak as it sounds, we're all going to end up, either cremated or buried. So the thing is this: you can make an impact in the world, and I think everyone strives to do that. But sometimes it's just nice to like I have a dog. I think I'm now spending a lot more time just decoupling from the work by just walking the dog, to being there for family, for friends, for loved ones, and then being empathetic when other people have like things going on, but then also being able to share to confidants. I think that maybe it's honesty, but I think honestly, but really like taking breaks and stuff. It's actually funny. So the paper that was affiliated with the Netflix documentary, I remember when we were working through, because I worked through in the States like Thanksgiving, so it was all through Thanksgiving break. It was like an entire month of just analyzing, writing, going back, redoing analysis and all that. So going back and forth. I think most of the ideas or the creative ideas that came up in terms of writing, like what the interpretation was when I was either A, working out, or B, just walking, or just see like, with a friend just talking. And I'm like, oh my God, wait. And then like, it's like, hey, one sec. And then just like typing up an idea that on my phone. So then the next day I could kind of go through. So while people will work and they think that you need to work constantly, I don't think that's true. I think that you find creativity when you're not working. And I think that creativity is what accelerates your career. Not saying that mine is accelerating. I think I love what I do, so it feels natural, but I think that's the biggest thing that I've been experiencing, and hopefully it continues.
Awesome. I think that's a perfect point to end on. So, Ryan, thank you much for the insight today. It's been educational from a scientific perspective, but also I think you've had some powerful points there that as we've just ended. So thank you very much for that. I'll be continuing to watch your career journey with great interest, and I'm certainly going to have to do one of these true diagnostic tests in the next few months, because Tony kept raving about them as well. So yeah, thank you very much for spending the time and speaking with me today.
Sure. Thank you again for this platform. This is fun.